go to sleep on me.
He's going to do that every 3 minutes. Hello all, and thank you for joining us today for the American Studies Lecture Series Fall event. We are very excited to host award-winning author, historian, archaeologist, and professor, Dr. Emerson Cad Baker. Dr. Baker is Interim Dean of Graduate and Professional Studies, as well as a professor of history at Salem State University. He is the award-winning author of many books on the history of early New England, including his most recent work, A Storm of Witchcraft, The Salem Trials and the American Experience, and The Devil of Great Island, Witchcraft and Conflict in Early New England. A resident of York, Dr. Baker has carried out extensive historical research and archaeological excavations on the early history of York County. He served as an advisor for PBS TV's American Experience and Colonial House, and is a member of the Gallows Hill Project team, who in 2016 confirmed the execution site of the Salem Trials. That's like Dr. Baker will discuss his recent book, which sets the Salem Witch Trials in the broader context of American history, from the 17th century to the present, and explores the many factors that created the largest witch hunt in American history. YCCC is thankful for the support from the National Endowment for the Humanities for making this series possible. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Baker.
And as a former chairman of the Maine Humanities Council, I thank the NEH as well too. And if you're not familiar with the great work of the National Endowment for the Humanities, it is a wonderful, wonderful organization. I'm really excited to be here and see them supporting particularly too an American Studies program, because they are really wonderful things, but also rare beasts these days, almost as rare as unicorns. Yeah, I actually won't talk about the discovery of Gallows Hill in my talk, because there's too much I can talk about, but I'm glad to answer questions on that. It was a pretty cool discovery. As I was saying earlier, what you're going to get here, though, is like the hour-long version of the 15-week graduate seminar of the 3 books and 20 years worth of research. So if I don't cover the accused you're interested in or the aspect you're interested in, I'll be happy to stay and answer questions and whatever, because it's an endlessly fascinating topic, and I think we realize that by the fact that about every year or two there's another book written on the subject, and frankly, most of them are really good, all with a different perspective. And we're almost sort of like a club of us, people who write books on the Salem Witch Trials. We all kind of work together, respect each other's work, and we all pretty much agree on most, but there's some subtle differences in our approaches. But anyhow, it's an amazing topic, and it is really one that is really perfect for an American Studies lecture, because it is such this important event in American history, and I would also argue in society and how we view ourselves. And to study it involves everything from GIS and cartography to literary analysis to all kinds of different types of history and historical geography, and you name it. So it is a really good American Studies topic. So here's the thing, though. I've taught at Salem State for my 25th year, and somehow Salem's the witch city, right? But what people don't realize is that witchcraft is almost universal throughout all cultures and all societies, throughout time. Almost every society has some version of witch hunts, and maybe one of the depressing conclusions I have to all this is that, frankly, as long as we have sort of hatreds and prejudices and scapegoating, we're going to have some version of witch trials. But the time period known as the Great Age of Witch Hunts, from roughly 1400 to around the American Revolution, is sort of seen as sort of that peak of witchcraft persecutions in the West, at least. And during that time, about 100,000 people are accused of witchcraft, and about half of them die. And frankly, the numbers are so big and round because we don't have all the names, because there were so many executions. Take, for example, the largest outbreak in Cologne, Germany, lasted a decade in the 1620s, and in that time period, about 2,000 people died. Now here's the thing, folks. I don't know about you, but I've been to Cologne. It's an amazing city. Spectacular cathedral. You go there, though, and no one breathes a word about witchcraft. So why is that? Why is Salem the witch city? Well, you know, maybe Salem wasn't the biggest, but it was the last, right? I mean, this was the age of reason, and well, it really wasn't. wasn't the age of reason quite, and it really wasn't the last, because we know in Hungary alone in the 18th century, there were about 800 people executed for witchcraft, and throughout Europe it continued. And in fact, you can read newspapers today where people are still being lynch mobs in places like India and parts of South Africa, are still regularly killing people with mob violence because they believe they're witches. So, in fact, we're still having witch hunts maybe in the United States, right? I mean, we certainly hear this word all the time. And here's our representative in Salem, Seth Moulton, sort of saying, yeah, this one, you know, the witch hunt against President Trump is not the greatest in American history. And I know because I represent Salem, Massachusetts. But the point is, I don't really mean here to pick on our president and his supporters, because witch hunts are always in the news. And one thing I do discuss in my book is what happened in Salem after 1692. And we know that really ever since the Salem witch trials, people have been making fun of Salem for the witch trials. And also, too, have been using witchcraft politically to invoke it for rushing to judgment and all those sorts of things that come with it, of extremism, fanaticism, right? And it's not just, even though the witch hunt du jour is the president's complaints of the witch hunt, but think about this. A couple of years ago, it was the Democrats talking about that Benghazi witch hunt that the Republicans are on. So my point is, folks, that pretty much all politicians of all stripes throughout time, left, right, or center, have used that analogy of the witch hunt. And in fact, of course, even worse than that, burning witches, which of course we never did in Salem. Very civilized, we only hanged them, right? Witchcraft in England and its colonies is a civil crime. It's not a religious crime, as it was on the continent. On the continent, witches were tried for not for treason really, but for heresy. And the punishment for heresy, of course, is burning at the stake. So the English at least never did that. So by European standards, the Salem witch trials are frankly kind of a fly speck. At least 172 people accused of witchcraft. 156 of surviving legal proceedings. I think one reason Salem is the witch city, and we know about the Salem witch trials, is because they are so well documented. Unlike a place like Cologne, we have almost 1,000 surviving documents for those trials. It's not a complete record. It's partial records in many of these cases. Frankly, we know that some records were destroyed or lost, quite deliberately, clearly in some cases. The families wanted to remove the shame from themselves and from the community. But so having said that, the scorecard in Salem, all these people accused, 19 executed, 1, Giles Corey, pressed to death, at least 5, perhaps 6, died in jail. By European standards, this doesn't even count as a witch hunt. Right? I mean, not even moderate size. And I don't say that out of lack of respect for the victims. My God, this is a horrible injustice. And in fact, in the middle of writing the book, I found out that one of the people who died in prison, Roger Toothaker, was like my 9th great uncle. Right? And as a matter of fact, I really think that if you scratch the surface of your family trees, even if your family's only been here, a generation, you're probably related to somebody involved in this. And if you aren't, the person sitting next to you, I'm sure is. So why, I was struck with this problem to begin with, is one reason I wrote this book was, so why isn't Cologne the witch city? Why is Salem the one that's synonymous with witch hunt and fanaticism and rushing to judgment? I've had friends go on African safaris and say in the middle of the desert in Africa, someone says, "Oh, you're from Salem, the witch city." What is with this? So why is that? How do we explain the events of 1692? And frankly, how do we explain witch hunts? What happened in 1692? Those are sort of the key points I want to try to cover with you this afternoon. I think the story starts, and again, my book really sort of starts. There's so many good books on Salem. Maybe the path-breaking one on the Salem witch trials is Boyer and Nissenbaum's Salem Possessed, which looks at conflict inside Salem Village. And I'll talk about it in a second. But the problem is, it just focuses on Salem Village and just the events of 1692. And in fact, this is a big story, and you have to understand Salem in proper context of the witch trials. And in that case, you have to understand Salem's history and the fact that, little known fact here, folks, Salem is the first settlement of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It's first settled in 1626. It becomes part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1629. Now, don't confuse this with Plymouth Colony, our neighbor to the south, right, which is 1620. But next to Plymouth, Salem is like the second oldest permanent, real settlement, if you will. Yes, we do have early fishing stations on the coast of Maine too. I'd be the first to say that those are really important. We have the Popham Colony of 1607, which doesn't last, but Salem is one of the earliest places settled in New England. Older than Boston, I like to point out to people when I'm talking in Massachusetts, right? And in fact, actually, when John Winthrop and the Winthrop fleet arrived in Salem in 1630 to really sort of create Massachusetts Bay, they sailed into Salem Harbor. And it's probably on the voyage over to Salem, or soon after their arrival, that Winthrop gives his very famous sermon, A Model of Christian Charity. And, of course, in that is that famous sermon that you probably all have had to read at one time or another in a U.S. history class. It's in pretty much every documentary reader you can imagine. He talks about Salem being the city upon a hill, Massachusetts Bay, but really, if you think about it, he's really talking about Salem, is that city upon a hill. This is going to be a Christian utopian experiment. This is going to be the heart of Christian perfection. We have to leave England because it's corrupt. We're going to try to reform the Church of England, but we're going to do it on our own terms, and we're going to be a shining example, the city upon the hill, for the rest of the world. And really, I think, physically and metaphorically, that city upon the hill in many ways was Salem itself, right? So imagine that within living memory of that speech, this is what we see. Right? Mother being accused by daughter, neighbor accusing neighbor of being witches, people turned against themselves and their ministers. What a horrible, huge fall from this beautiful ideal of utopian Christian perfection, right? And I think it's such a tremendous fall that people in Salem and people, frankly, throughout the United States and the world have not let us forget how far they fell from that ideal. So to me, to have this city of peace, which is, of course, what Salem is named for, Jerusalem, the city of peace. So Salem means peace, right? To have this horrible irony of this, one of these most horrible incidents in American history to take place in peace is a turning point in American history. And I'm not just saying this because my book is published in Oxford's Pivotal Moments in American History. I genuinely believe, before I started writing the book and got the contract, that Salem changed things for us in many ways. Directly, I think it's really the beginning of the end of Puritan New England and all that comes with that. It's the beginning of the division of church and state. Governor Phipps, during the Salem witch trials, his top advisors are the leading ministers of the colony. I think after the Salem witch trials, people realized that maybe we need to start thinking about putting some distance. That might not be the wisest move. And indeed, I really think in many ways, the Salem witch trials represent the beginnings of American distrust of government. Now, I know what some of you are thinking is, oh no, I thought that was with the Crucible or with Watergate. No, and again, I think that libertarian streak in American politics runs deep. And again, we saw this in the election of 2016 with people on both sides, right? The Trumpists and the Bernie supporters. We don't like what we're seeing here. We don't trust this government. Give us something different. We think that's a recent instinct, but if you go back through American history, again, I can trace it, I think, in many ways back to Salem. Why? Because we have that first massive failure of the government to protect the innocent. And actually, then at the end of it, I won't really talk about this much today, we have Governor Phipps, the governor who actually calls for a cover-up. He issues a publication ban and says, okay, no one's going to talk about this. We've heard enough. Well, we know what happens when you try to cover things up. It usually just makes sure that people never want to forget it, right? And that's, I think, what happened here. People really refused to let the witch trial be forgotten. Okay, so what happened? Well, how do I explain what happened? I use the perfect storm analogy for the title of my book, equating it to that other great Essex County tragedy, in part because to have the largest outbreak by far of witchcraft in American history, you have to have a lot of things go bad. Now, let me say that about 100 people were accused of witchcraft in New England before the Salem witch trials. Matter of fact, before Salem, more people were accused in Connecticut than Massachusetts. Oh, and by the way, in Salem, more people were accused from Andover than Salem. So I fully understand why we don't call it the Andover witch trial, maybe, right? But anyhow, here's the point. It takes a lot of bad things happening at once to create a perfect storm, whether it be oceanographic, So that's what I talk about in the book, is all of these range of factors. And if I had to boil it down, I'd say most of them are related to religion and politics. Ultimately, witchcraft is a religious crime, and it's tried by political means. And I just mentioned that because I think myself, and actually most of the historians who've written about the witch trials over the past 30 or 40 years, tend to be social historians. There's actually a recent historiography out, the most recent book on Salem is a historiography that basically accuses the social historians of not having sympathy for the victims of the Salem witch trials, because you had all these social historians writing in the 1970s and 1980s trying to explain the witch hunts as a sociological phenomenon. Well, I think there's legitimacy to those interpretations. They're some of the best books written, and some that really influenced me when I was an undergrad and in grad school. But let's remember that it's really a religious crime, right? And it starts, indeed, in Salem Village in a sort of political religious setting. Now, Salem Village, first off, one of the ironies of the Salem witch trials is that most of the action didn't take place in what's now Salem. The center of activity in the Salem witch trials was Salem Village, which is present-day Danvers, the town immediately to the west, which we find it rather amusing that Salem has haunted happenings and Danvers is a very normal, small city, lovely place that doesn't do much special except try to commemorate the witch trials as best they can and pay respect to the victims. So Salem in the 17th century is a much larger beast than today. By 1692, about half the town has already been carved off, all the way Beverly, Wenham, on up the coast of Manchester, Massachusetts, had all been part of one town. And gradually they split apart, but by 1692, we still have Salem consisting of present-day Salem, Peabody, Danvers, and part of Middleton. That's a large chunk of the North Shore, right? And here's the problem, folks. If your one meeting house is right here on the neck in what's downtown Salem, the intersection of today's Essex and Washington Street, if you live out here, Salem Village, you may have 8 or 9 miles, or here in Middleton, as many as 15 miles to walk on Sunday to go to Sabbath, to attend the worship service, on a day that's supposed to be the Lord's Day, a day of rest. And imagine what that was like in February with a couple feet of snow on the ground, right? So people in Salem Village wanted to hire their own minister to create their own town where they could only have to walk a couple of miles to meeting. So this is the area that kind of wants to break off. But for a number of reasons that we could go into a whole book on, Salem, the town, doesn't want to give Salem Village its freedom. Finally, after years of struggle in 1672, they say, okay, you're going to still be part of Salem, but if you want to take some of your tax money and use it to build a meeting house and hire a minister, go ahead. So it's got kind of parish status, but there's a problem here, and that is, it's sort of a stillborn town, and it doesn't have proper political governance. It just has a committee that can pay the minister, but not necessarily hire and fire. So by 1692, this town is just caught up in political and religious factionism. They are on their 4th minister in 20 years, when Reverend Samuel Parris is there in 1692. And each one of those 3 predecessors left amidst religious disputes. Right? George Burroughs had been the second minister, he'd been minister in Falmouth, present-day Portland, Maine, was a war refugee from King Philip's War in the 1670s, came down to Salem, preached for a few years, and then when they cut off his salary, he said, okay, fine, I'm going back to Maine. The war's over, I'm going back to Falmouth, because this is way too much, because as one of his parishioners complained to him, we have brother fighting with brother. It's not good. So you have this factionalism, and it focuses in particular around the minister, Reverend Samuel Parris, who was not a very good peacemaker, let's just say. Lacked those skills to do that, and clearly was caught up in the middle of this really sort of huge religious political dispute. The disputes, though, go beyond Salem Village. There's also this political, colony-wide political stability. And this has to go with the sort of unusual situation that Massachusetts Bay found itself in 1692. Massachusetts Bay originally had a charter of 1629 that allowed it self-governance and allowed it to create essentially a Puritan state where there was one religion, the Puritan Church. That charter had been revoked in the 1680s when the king got rather upset with Massachusetts for its behavior. By the way, amongst the other things that Massachusetts had done was to take over the colony to the north, two colonies north, New Hampshire and Maine. Right? And while New Hampshire managed to escape, Maine would remain a part of Massachusetts, of course, until 1820. The king puts in a new government under Edmund Andros. He is an English military colonel. He is almost like a political dictator. He allows people to worship in the Anglican fashion in the Church of England, which really upsets the Puritans. He takes away people's civil liberties. Rather than electing the governor or electing juries, he's appointing them. So people get kind of upset about this. It gets so bad that in 1689 they overthrow Andros, lock him in jail, and send him back to England. And the king, and by this time, the king and queen, William and Mary, it takes them a couple of years to come up with a new form of government and a new governor. Finally, in January 1692, about the time that the first afflictions start in Salem Village, in the home of the minister, Salem and Boston hears that there's a new governor coming, and he's this Maine guy, Sir William Phipps, who is a really interesting character. He has no political experience. Imagine this. Imagine having the supreme leader of your land having no political experience whatsoever, that his first office is as your leader. And imagine, just imagine that this guy is a businessman who's made his fortune through high-risk, high-reward stakes, and that also he's known for his salty tongue because he's a sailor. Anyhow, in 1692, you can see where people in Salem might have been a little unsettled by what this new governor was going to be like. Right? He'd only recently, by the way, converted to his political cause. He'd only recently become a Puritan. So this leaves people a little uneasy, and I will say that there are a couple factors that cause witch hunts throughout time. It's a great book on witch hunts in world history by Wolfgang Behringer. And Behringer notes that combinations of bad weather and a weak central government cause witch hunts, right? Because people look, in times of trouble, like when there's famine, people look to their government to help them. And if their government doesn't give assurances, they start taking matters into their own hand, and cries of witch hunt reign in the land. Right? And all of these things are seen as signs of Puritan decline, the decline of that Puritan city upon a hill, that perhaps the Puritans aren't as devout as they once were. Well, you know, that's not surprising, because we're in the third generation, right? And I think in many ways we all like to be good children and grandchildren and emulate our parents. But you know, we're different, right? And that second generation lacked that fire in the belly that made them give up everything back in England and come over to worship as Puritans in New England. And while the sons and daughters, many of them wanted to be members of the church, they didn't feel that special calling that God had called them and told them that they were amongst his elect, his saved. So this was sort of a crisis. You have shrinking church membership. You have increasing wealth and worldliness, as frankly, Massachusetts makes a fortune harvesting lumber and fish from the coast of Maine and selling it into the Atlantic economy. And we have a lot of rich merchants in Boston with fancy houses. And they're getting away from that Puritan sort of ascetic kind of ideal, right? Now, the Puritans were never just folks who dressed in black and white and did not have fun. No, forget those stereotypes. But they really were about being devotion to God. And the richer you get, the more the temptation is to say, maybe I'm not going to make meeting this Sunday. You know? I've worked a hard week. I've made lots of money. I'm just going to rest at home and honor the Lord that way. So what you have in Salem and Massachusetts by the 1690s is more taverns and less Bible reading, right? And increasingly, the ministers are becoming upset. People like Reverend Parris in Salem Village are calling for moral reformation. We need to get back to the true Word of God. We need to get back to school, because the purpose of school is to read the Bible. We need to have less singing and dancing. Now, that doesn't mean we can't have taverns, but it really needs to be one and done, folks, right? Because as I like to tell my 20-something daughters, nothing good happens after midnight, especially in a tavern. I think that's true today, as well as 1692. And in fact, it's really kind of interesting that during the Salem witch trials, there are 5 ministers and 45 kin of ministers who were accused of witchcraft. It's one of these sorts of factors that I uncovered in my research. Only one of them, of course, pays the ultimate price, George Burroughs. Yes, George Burroughs, the minister from Wells. We'll talk more about him. So you have people doubting the decline of where they are Puritanism, and if they've broken their sacred bonds with God. And one of the things people doubt, reason they doubt this is how bad the weather is. To a Puritan, before the age of reason, everything is a sign of God's pleasure or displeasure. Right? Rainbows, thumbs up. Asteroids, comets, droughts, God's angry. Why is God angry? We've wandered and strayed from the true and pure path. Well, it turns out we now know that the weather in the 1680s and 1690s was the worst weather in North America in probably a 400-year period, known as the Little Ice Age, where weather tended to be colder. This is the time known as the Maunder Minimum, where you have the coldest, nastiest winters. Think, what, about 3 winters ago? Remember how lovely that was? Every Sunday and Monday. At Salem State, we didn't have Monday classes until February. Right? We lost the first month of the semester. Then you have killer frosts in the spring, just after you planted your crops. A hot, dry, drought-like summer, which wipes out more crops. And then just in case anything survived, you've got a killer frost in like mid to late August that wipes out what's left. Horrible, right? So, again, extreme weather, people are suffering, there's famine, there's inflation, there's starvation, there's misery, and people are looking for answers. If it could possibly be worse, how could it be worse? How about Massachusetts is terribly losing a horrible war on the frontier? A war fought, that's right, folks, right here in Maine, and even right here in Wells and York. The settlements here were under attack by the Wabanaki Native Americans and their French allies. And in fact, by 1692, they have destroyed almost all the settlements up here. In January of 1692, again, about the same time that the first afflictions take place in Salem Village, people in Salem hear of the destruction of York, almost complete annihilation of the town, where 50 people are killed and 80 people are taken captive by a Native American raid. One of the victims being the Puritan minister, Reverend Dummer. To actually have a Puritan minister fall at the hands of the enemy was seen as a horrible thing, particularly this enemy, because this isn't just a military disaster, folks. It's a sign to the Puritans. Look who the enemy is. The English, Puritans in particular, had a near pathological hatred of the Catholics and the French. They were in fear of the Pope and all sorts of conspiracies by the Pope to reclaim England as a Catholic country. So they were in mortal fear of the Pope, and to have the French, who we would see, pardon me, as minions of the Pope, right, as papists, in league with Native Americans, who, again, were not Christian, right, they were pagan. To have these two forces seen kind of as agents of Satan to be in league and destroying New England was a horrible, ominous spiritual sign as well as a military disaster. And as the towns get destroyed, you have settlers from towns like Salem who moved up to places like Casco Bay in the 1680s, having to come back home. War refugees burnt out, many people, widows, orphans, lots of starving mouths to feed. Taxes go up to pay for the army and to pay for support of all these immigrants. It is a bad situation, and it keeps getting worse around 1692. Amidst the Salem witch trials in the summer of 1692, there's a major attack on Wells, the Storer garrison. You've probably seen the memorial right over there on Route 1, less than a mile from here, right? Undergoes this major assault by this combined force of about 400 Native Americans and French, and they managed to withhold it, but pretty much the rest of Wells is completely burnt and destroyed, right? So there's almost nothing left up here by this point. And frankly, people in Essex County, in Salem, are wondering, are we going to be next? Hard as it is to believe New England in, so basically places like Danvers, Andover, are on the frontier and were susceptible, and in fact were, in some cases, attacked. We know there were attacks on Andover, on Billerica, Haverhill during this war. So there's a real war panic loose too here. So, okay, that's kind of like the background here. What causes the afflictions and the accusations? Well, again, it's a long, complicated story, but I'll give you what I think are some of the main factors. And again, there is no single magic bullet, right? I think the the factor that affected the first victims is what we now call today mass conversion disorder, what used to be known as mass hysteria, right? But that's very much of a gendered crime or gendered affliction, something that only happens to women. That clearly, men can't be hysterical. Well, yes, we can. Right? And many of them were during the Salem witch trials. But in fact, mass conversion disorder. It's a very tricky diagnosis. I am not a clinical psychiatrist, nor do I play one on television. And frankly, even if I were, this is hard to diagnose if you have a patient in front of you. So trying to say what's going on with people 300 years ago is tough, but the parallels are uncanny. So let me describe this to you. Mass conversion disorder suggests your mind is completely overwhelmed and overwrought, anxiety, panic, worry, fear of Native American attack, all kinds of things going on there, fear of Puritan decline, worried that Reverend Parris is screaming these fire and brimstone sermons, saying that God is coming, he's terribly angry. So that mental anguish converts to physical symptoms. This is not faking. The victims do not know that they're doing this, which makes it all the more terrifying. Because if they don't know what's going on, it just makes it worse, right? They don't understand why they're barking like a dog, why they have hysterical blindness, why they feel like someone's sticking 1,000 pins in them, why they want to throw themselves in the fire, which makes it even worse, right? No control over it. Interesting thing about mass conversion disorder. The target population we know today, teenagers, overwhelmingly teenage girls. Interesting fact, huh? Also, too, usually starts with high-status people. You know, I think I have two daughters who've made it well and safely into their 20s, but I think we all realize that my older daughter was the first one born in the family since the Civil War. So, you know, I'd never seen a Barbie doll before I became a dad. I had no idea about all this stuff. And I tell you, it seems to me amazing the stress we put on our young people, particularly on our young women, on our teenage girls, is excessive, right? And it certainly was in the 17th century, in a very patriarchal, controlling Puritan society, male-dominated, right, by the fathers, by the ministers. Well, think about this. There's a very famous case of mass conversion disorder that was diagnosed in Leroy, New York, about 6 or 7 years ago now. I actually talk about it in the book. And in this case, who are the first victims? The cheerleaders in the local high school. Most places, that's right near the top of the social pecking order, right? And then it goes down and out throughout the rest of the high school population until you have a dozen or so kids just, what we might say is acting out, but they're not acting out. They're undergoing this mental illness, which is converting into physical symptoms. Interesting, in Salem Village, who are the first two to be afflicted? A 9-year-old and a 12-year-old. Abigail Williams, who is the niece of Reverend Parris and lives with him, and Betty Parris, the minister's daughter. So these little girls are in the parsonage where the Reverend is practicing his sermons, pacing around, belching out these fire and brimstone sermons. They've taken away his salary. They're trying to get him to leave town. They've taken away his supply of firewood. So the family, the girls, are probably cold. They may go hungry occasionally, and Dad is freaking out. And he's telling us God is angry and he's coming for us. And he doesn't mean to, but I think in many ways he is literally scaring those girls to death, or at least into conversion disorder. Now, a point of information here, witchcraft is a gendered crime. This would be good for all you folks taking women's history right now. About 75% of the accused of witchcraft throughout history tend to be women. In Salem, it's actually 76%, so it's about on target. Of course, in Puritan society, in English society, women were considered to be the weaker vessel, more susceptible to Satan's wiles, right? You realize that's a load of nonsense today, but unfortunately that was the belief, that the women were more susceptible to this attack. And in fact, the percentages are even more skewed than that, because the men who are accused tend to be relatives or defenders of women who are accused. Witchcraft was believed to pass through families, in fact. So in 1692 in Salem, the afflicted are referred to as the afflicted girls. And I put it in quotes because, in fact, yes, most of the group were girls in their teenage years, most of them between about, the key accusers are mostly between about 16 and 20. But, and also the group also initially included a Native American man who was a slave of Reverend Paris. And also, one of the Salem witch trials judges, Judge Corwin, included his own son amongst the afflicted. A little conflict of interest today by our legal standards, right? To be questioning someone who's afflicted your son with witchcraft. But having said that too, so what we're talking about here is spectral affliction, right? And this is the key form of evidence in Salem that is very questionable, right? In the 17th century. And that is the fact that it is someone's invisible specter who is harming, or spirit, or ghost, that is harming me. And only I can see the attack that, and there's no, wait, there's no one there. No, yes, there is, you can't see? Well, I guess it's the specter doing the attacking. Now, to us, this seems kind of crazy, right? And it did in the 17th century, too. But not for the reasons that we would think. Because in the 17th century, here's the problem, folks. Witches are real. Witchcraft is real. Kings, emperors, governors, popes, ministers, all know witchcraft is real. The witches are real. Witches get their power from Satan. Satan is created by God as a test of mankind. So if you don't believe in witches, that's a slippery slope. And in the 1690s, people aren't really ready to go up that slope and suggest that God doesn't exist. So witchcraft is real. The problem is spectral evidence. And there's a dispute over that because to some people, a number of people in Massachusetts in 1692 said spectral evidence is pretty dicey stuff because you know, Satan is the great trickster. And it can be that Satan can seize a pure and innocent person's soul and use it to harm others. And that's kind of like a twofer, right? Because one is you get to afflict someone, and the other is you get someone else in trouble and being accused of being a witch. Other people said, including, unfortunately, the Salem witchcraft judges, they said, no. Satan can only use someone's spirit. A witch can only harness someone's spirit who is corrupt of soul and is already in league with Satan. So if we're seeing your specter, you're guilty. You're harming people with it, right? Having said that, too, so we hear all about the afflicted girls, and if you've seen any special or any documentary on Salem, it includes girls screaming and writhing on the floor and all kinds of stuff. But in fact, there was a more traditional form of witchcraft in 1692 as well. Dozens of people testified to, oh, she cursed my cow and it stopped producing milk the next week, so therefore she's a witch. Or causing ships to sink at sea, lightning strikes, storms, hail that destroys a crop. All were acts of witchcraft. And all of these and more people were accused of during the Salem witch trials. And not just by the afflicted girls, but by people, a cross-section of society. Because everybody believed in witchcraft. So this core group, though, we sort of focused on, the afflicted girls, lead pretty tough, stressful lives. Most of them are, as I say, late teens. They tend to be household servants, living and working in another household. Some of them are orphans. Many of them are war refugees from Maine. And even if some are orphans, they've lost at least one parent, or have a brother or a father off fighting on the Maine frontier, a very uncertain fate. My favorite example of this, Mercy Short of Salmon Falls, present-day South Berwick and Berwick, Maine. Mercy actually lived not far from Route 236 in Berwick, Maine. And she and her family were victims of the Salmon Falls raid, another one of these raids, like the ones 2 years later on York and Wells. This raid, a combined French and native force attacks at dawn in March and almost wipes out the town, taking dozens of people, again, prisoner, burning the town. Mercy has her parents, 3 siblings, all killed by the Native Americans. She and 5 more siblings and other neighborhood kids are rounded up into captivity, marched to Canada, where many of them actually will eventually be converted to Catholicism. Mercy's lucky, however, because just at that point, Sir William Phips has tried to invade Canada. It's a complete failure, but at least while he's there, he's able to exchange prisoners. And Mercy is ransomed and brought back to Massachusetts. But her life is destroyed, right? Her chances of having that good what we'd consider to be a middle-class farm life, you know, marrying the cute farm boy next door and having a family. No. In Massachusetts, if you're a poor girl with no resources, with no family, you're lucky to be a household servant. No rich boy is going to look twice at you. You'll be lucky to find any husband at all and to escape a life of servitude. So her life is many ways over as she knows it when her mistress in Boston in 1692 sends her to the jail on an errand, and one of the witches from Salem, who's being housed in the jails in Boston, because all the jails in Massachusetts are overcrowded. This witch curses her. And Mercy, frankly, what to say, freaks out, right? She becomes afflicted. And fortunately for her minister, and for us, her minister is Cotton Mather, brilliant young Puritan minister, and he writes down a whole study of her affliction and describes her attack. And it's clear that she's, by today's standards, she's suffering from what we call PTSD. Because when Mather says, Mercy, describe, you said, Satan tempted you, wanted you to sign this book. What did Satan look like? She says, he was tawny, like an Indian. And she goes on to talk about these spirits and specters that are with Satan. And they were Native Americans and Frenchmen, some of whom she knew by name. And essentially, she is reliving that horrible time in her life. And, you know, I think most people in Maine and New Hampshire during this time period had PTSD, right? You go out hunting, you have to tell your wife, look, I'm going hunting. If you hear one shot, don't worry. We're bringing home deer for dinner. You hear 2 shots, run like hell to the garrison. Don't think about me. I'm probably not coming back. It's a pretty rough time up here. Remember, at the time, basically, you have Route 1 is the King's Highway in Wells, and you have houses on either side of it, and maybe some sawmills up into the interior a little bit, but pretty much that's it. Once you know, where we would be here, the next house to the north from here would be up in Canada. Nothing in between except the Native Americans, right? So you're always vulnerable to attack where they might come out of the woods at a moment's notice. Pretty tough life. By the way, I could equally tell you how tough it was for the Native Americans who had their villages destroyed, innocent civilians, women and children slaughtered by the English militia as well too. This was not a happy time for anyone who lived in this region. But clearly Mercy Short was one of the victims of PTSD, which was, of course, takes the form in this case of witchcraft. There are other things going on with these afflicted people too. Verbal and physical abuse. I think most definitely. Here's the thing, folks. If you read the transcripts from 1692 of the trials, it is clear that these specters who were afflicting the girls, in many cases, are the specters of men who are accused of witchcraft. These men happen to be servants, to be masters of these serving girls. And what are these specters of these masters doing? Beating, striking, choking, hurting these girls. Now, I might dismiss that except for the fact that most of these men did have histories of violence. John Willard, executed at the witch trials, was a fairly notorious wife beater, which may explain why members of his own wife's family testified against him at the trials. Right? George Burroughs, the minister of Wells, his wife's, he was on his 3rd wife in 1692, and this was not common. Many people died. Women had a high percentage of death in childbirth. So to be on your 3rd wife in middle-aged was not unusual. But in this case, George Burroughs, the ghosts of his 2 dead wives, came in their bloody winding sheets, their burial shrouds, and told the afflicted girls that he murdered them. Well, interesting, isn't it, that George Burroughs, amongst the complaints against her for witchcraft, was the charge of supernatural strength. That he could pick up a whole barrel of molasses by himself, or he could take his finger and stick it in the barrel of a long musket and pick it up. So here's this strong, tough guy who's very controlling, very secretive. He won't let his wives write letters home to their parents unless he censors it, reads it first. So this controlling, strong guy. It's not a stretch to think that maybe he was willing to use violence against his spouse. Remember, too, in the 17th century, physical violence is acceptable by society. Husbands could cuff around their wives if they weren't happy with them. husbands and wives would do the same to children and servants. You were not allowed to excessively beat people. You might get in trouble with the court for that, but more important than that, it was a sign of a failed marriage or a failed family, which was the most important thing to Puritans. But certainly, to be occasionally struck for a serving girl would not be out of the question at all. But it's clear here that there seems to be more than that going on in many of these cases. So, just as an aside on George Burroughs, yeah, interesting guy. He's a Harvard-trained minister who spends most of his life as a minister in Maine, except for making the mistake of being in Salem Village for a couple of years, which made him kind of a marked man later on. And by the 1680s, he's gone back to Falmouth, Maine, which is reformed. Falmouth and much of Maine in the 17th century was wiped out a number of times. First in King Philip's War in 1675 and 76. Again in King William's War in the 1680s, 1690s. So, Burroughs is the minister in Falmouth, what we now call Portland. And he leaves town apparently soon before the whole community is destroyed in a French and Native American attack. One of the few people, he and his family, to survive that horrible attack. Which again, well, we might say, boy, you lucked out there. Some people in 1691, 92 were going like, was that luck? Or did he have advanced warning from Satan? Seems kind of uncanny that he escaped that. And of course, in 1690, he actually moves to Wells, which at the time was in need of a minister. And he would have preached on this site, right? The site of the first church, the present location of the Wells Algonquin Historical Society, York County Genealogical Society. This here is a later church built on the same site, roughly, but you go there, you can see this plaque, the first meeting house built there, and this is where George Burroughs would have preached, and he would have probably lived nearby. He wasn't here long enough to actually buy real estate, at least it wasn't recorded, but he would have probably lived somewhere within a mile of here. And it was from here that they came up and got him, and took him back in chains to Salem to face trial for witchcraft. And again, the associations of Burroughs and the war and the frontier, that wilderness filled with devils and Indians and Frenchmen and all sorts of opponents of Puritanism. Why would a Harvard-trained minister even want to be minister in a place like Falmouth or Wells, in that God-forsaken Maine frontier, right? Puritans were very much afraid of that howling wilderness, that frontier. So Burroughs, I think, one reason he was brought to the attention of folks was simply because he was a minister in Maine. How about Giles Corey? Pressed to death. You know, Giles Corey is one of the people that people find the most interesting in the Salem witch trials. And I'm always asked about Corey. Now, let me get clear. No one deserves to be pressed to death, especially not an 80-year-old man. But Giles Corey was not a nice guy. Not a nice guy at all. A few years before, back in 1675, he had actually used a stick to severely beat his young, as he's described, as simple-minded teenage servant, Jacob Goodell. Goodell actually dies a few days later, at which point Corey is brought before the court, and he's convicted essentially of manslaughter. They can't prove that he killed him. Clearly, there's contributing factors here. But again, you know, he had the right to sort of strike him, so how guilty? Long story short, he gets off with a conviction and a fine. And that didn't set well with many people in the community. A few years later, Corey is accused of arson, of setting fire to the house of his neighbor, John Proctor. Present day, part of Salem Village, then today is part of Peabody, Massachusetts. So, not a nice guy. And yes, in 1692, Giles Corey's apparition, his specter, beats the afflicted girls with his staff. Do I think that's a coincidence? Absolutely not. Giles Corey was known as an old curmudgeon, a tough guy who beat his servants, right? And if he didn't like the neighbors, burnt down their house, or at least tried to. How about John Proctor, the neighbor? His servant is Mary Warren. Now, by the way, Abigail Williams, as in the Crucible, is not his servant. There is no love affair between Abigail, age 12, and John Proctor, age 60. Let's just say that Arthur Miller's a great playwright, but not much of a historian. Well, what's interesting is his serving girl, Mary Warren, is very much involved in the Salem witch trials. And she accuses John Proctor's specter of threatening violence against him. And in fact, his specter threatens Mary with hot fire tongs. And he admits, in fact, to threatening to burn her out of a fit. Fire tongs, right? And he admits to trying to thresh the devil out of her. Proctor thinks this is nonsense, right? He can't believe that people are listening to these accusations of witchcraft, and he's going to show his serving girl, and shut her up. Well, probably a little too much violence in doing that, and probably too outspoken in his opposition to what was going on. And of course, it lands him in trial, and of course, he will be executed for witchcraft himself. But again, a guy with kind of like a violent tongue and probably a sort of a ability to strike his servant girl, and that meant he ultimately paid the price. Okay, conversion, PTSD, all kinds of abuse, war hysteria. There's more. Certainly, there are fraudulent accusations here. And honestly, probably more than we'd like to admit, right? But again, we don't like to think the worst of our teenagers. A couple of things it wasn't, though. By 1692, no, ergot was not a factor in the Salem witch trials. Ergot, of course, is this natural mold that forms on wet rye grain. People made bread out of rye so they would store it in piles in their barn. If it gets damp, you can get mold on it. That mold is a poison. It was pointed out by a theory in the early 1970s, actually I say in the Timothy Leary LSD days, boy, these people were just having like bad trips, you know, because that ergot poisoning would also has LSD in it, and there were people like having LSD-like side effects. Well, it sounds good, but again, there's all sorts of problems, and this theory was destroyed within months of being published. First off, there are a couple different types of ergot poisoning, and only one has hallucinogenic side effects, right? And you look like this when your has happened, right? Which essentially you get gangrene, dry rot, your limbs shrivel, blacken, fall off, you die. That didn't happen in 1692, folks. Most of the afflicted girls led relatively long lives. And also, too, disease process. If you're being poisoned, you get worse and worse and worse and worse, and you die. The afflicted girls would be perfectly normal, and then a suspected witch would appear in the courtroom, and they would all of a sudden start having fits. And then the afflicted witch would leave, and they'd be back to normal. Doesn't make any sense at all. And also, too, remember I mentioned Mercy Short, afflicted girl of Boston. They were afflicted in Andover, there was afflicted in Salem, there was afflicted in Boston. That's an awful lot of moldy bread. And why is it that there's only one person per family and not everybody having these afflictions? So, sorry, I don't believe in encephalitis or Lyme disease either. I will say, is it possible that one or two people had some of these symptoms? Yeah, but does that explain the whole outbreak? No. There's a perfectly good 17th century medical diagnosis, by the way, folks. Bewitchment. These people were, in fact, bewitched, right? Well, okay, maybe it wasn't ergot, but clearly accusations were made to get people's land, right? Well, no, sorry. Again, not the case. Yes, it is true in 1692 that a convicted felon could have their personal possessions seized, their movables, clothing, cash, livestock, furniture, but your land, your house, even if you were executed for a felony, passed unimpeded to your heirs. So, also too, when possessions were seized, well, as we know, every April 15th, folks, it's the state that wins. All assets seized went to the crown. There was no finder's fee. That isn't to say that there wasn't neighborly disputes involved in the witch trials, but it wasn't like, oh, they got a really nice farm, I'm going to accuse them of witchcraft to get their land. No luck, right? Okay. So, last thing I really kind of want to talk about is focusing on the judges, which is something that I looked at in my book. And my thought was, this is English courtrooms, English justice. You have evidence, you have grand juries, you have trial by jury. It looks pretty much like English law today. What went wrong in 1692? And for that, you can have crazy juries coming up with verdicts that are bad, but you have a panel of 9 judges, 9 learned judges who have to agree with that verdict. Why did they do that? So I spent a lot of time studying the judges, trying to figure out why they turned legal precedent on its head. Because before 1692, if you confessed to witchcraft, usually, by the way, after mild or judicial torture, you were executed. Right? No doubt. Some of those cases before 1692 that had happened amongst some of the judges who served in Salem. But in 1692, only those who refuse to confess are convicted and executed. This, to me, is the fact that most people don't realize. That to me is the ultimate injustice. And you can see why people were so upset in Massachusetts in 1692. 55 people confessed to witchcraft and lived. That's over a third of the accused. And only those who died are those who plead not guilty. No one who pled guilty. Something's wrong here. So I started looking at the judges, and the 9 judges have a lot in common. They're wealthy merchants. They're members of the governor's council, appointed actually to it in the charter of 1691 by the king. Today we would call that council our state senate. So imagine that your state senator is also your local county judge, is also the wealthiest merchant in town. So these folks are the 1%. Majority of them attended Harvard, which is where people went to be trained for ministers, right? But none of them were ministers in 1692. They were merchants. They were the elite of society. So there's really a lot of power here in the hands of these folks, and it's too much. And not only is it individuals, but these folks, I started doing the genealogy on these folks, and 6 out of 9 of them are actually brother-in-laws connected by marriage. So they really are a class and a group that act as a group, and they follow the lead of the Chief Justice William Stoughton, who they're deferential to. And most of these fellows, as merchants, have made their fortunes in speculating in Maine lands. These guys own thousands of acres of Maine lumber lands. They built sawmills. And by 1692, those sawmills have been destroyed. We know that the Salmon Falls sawmill, Berwick, Maine, of Judge Sewell, he estimates his losses in modern day terms at over $1 million in losses. This land, which before the war had some value, now is worthless. Judges Corwin and Haythorne have interest in the family sawmill in what's now on the Mousen River, the Maine Falls, right in downtown Kennebunk. And that too has been destroyed in the war, as has Bartholomew Gedney's mill in Yarmouth on the West Custago River. So these guys have suffered huge losses in the war. And ironically, they're the ones leading the war effort. Yes, in addition to being judges and politicians and wealthy merchants, these fellows also happen to be the military leaders of the colony. Most of them are officers, majors, colonels, and in fact, one of the 9 judges, Colonel Waite Winthrop, yes, the grandson of the great John Winthrop, he's the commander-in-chief of the Massachusetts Army that's losing the war. Now here's the problem, folks. I think it's human nature to look outward. We tend not to blame ourselves for our problems. And so you imagine these fellows who've lost, millions of dollars worth of investments, saying, it's the government's fault. Oh wait, that's us. No, but it's got to be the military. Wait, we're the military too. Who is responsible then for this, for the destruction of the colony, for all these problems we face? Clearly, as Dana Carvey used to say on Saturday Night Live, could it be Satan? It's far too easy to blame someone else. And in this case, it is clear by all the things going wrong that Satan is present in the colony. And the conditions make the judges presume guilt from the start. Satan is loose in Massachusetts. And you can see this on the first day of questioning. In an English courtroom, which usually you talk about these sort of standard rules of evidence and the assumption of innocence. But look at the first questions asked to poor Sarah Good, who's brought up on charges of witchcraft. What evil spirit have you familiarity with? Have you made no contract with the devil? Why do you hurt these children? Seems like they forgot to ask, and when did you stop beating your husband, right? There's an assumption of guilt here. People knew that Satan was loose in the colony, and the judges realized that their job was to round up the witches and to eliminate them. And I think this is when they realized, here's the thing. If you're a young boy in Massachusetts heading to Harvard, it's clear that your life is going to be as a clergy member, and that you're a very devout young boy. But somewhere along the way, their lives got turned, and they became merchants. And I think a lot of them always wondered, they had doubts. Very devout folks, they had doubts as to why that had happened to them. And I think all became clear in 1692, because in 1692, it was not going to be ministers who could save the colony, it was going to be the judges. And they took their job far too seriously, and frankly were far too good at it. So in concluding, we think we're a lot smarter today, I'm sure, right? People always tell me, how could they be so superstitious? Why did they believe this nonsense? Well, again, as I've said, witches were real in 1692. Everybody believed in them. Their goal was to destroy your society, to overturn your government, to end your faith, to kill your family, wipe out your cities. But here's the problem, folks. It's an invisible enemy that's almost impossible to detect, because anybody could be a witch. Your neighbor, your daughter, your husband. So what do? The government has to help us. They've got to root out the witches and get rid of them. Well, the government's trying, but the government doesn't know much more than we do either, right? They give the assurances, but they don't really ring that true. So what do? How do we stop it? Well, here's the thing, folks. If you swap the word witch in 1692, and by the way, this has nothing to do with the modern-day neo-pagan religion of Wicca, very different group of folk. I would not accuse modern-day Wiccans of having pacts with Satan at all. All right? We're talking about 17th century satanic cult witches, right, who are in league with Satan to kill people. Right? If you swap those people and that word witches with terrorists today, I think you understand the problem these people faced in 1692. Right? It's a difficult problem. How do we know who the enemy is when we know the enemy is there and they want to destroy us? And how much of our liberties, of our way of life, are we willing to give up to meet that challenge? But of course, we don't believe in witches or witch hunts, do we? Thank you very much. We're talking over an hour, so I know some people need to leave or get up and stretch, but I'm also, so feel free, but I'm also happy to answer any questions people have. So if you have any questions, I just want to come in afterwards and sit down and ask. Questions? Way back there.
Yes, I had a question. So you mentioned that many of the men that have been accused in this, you mentioned that many of the men accused in the witch trials were often abusive towards their families or servants.
As far as we can tell.
Yeah, well, yes, as far as we can tell. But I have a question. Why do you think many of the women were accused? Do you think they were equally abusive to their servants and that, or do you think they were just caught up in this like conversion disorder?
So, I think in some cases you are talking about the women who have servants who are being accused as well. That's certainly part of it. It also certainly gets caught up with the political factions in Salem Village, where some of these people, like Rebecca Nurse, she's a Puritan saint. There's no reason why she should be accused of witchcraft, right? So there are other reasons. In this case, one clear reason that Moira Nissenbaum may talk about in Salem Disaster is her husband Francis is one of the leaders of the opposition of Reverend Paris. Now, do I think that Reverend Paris is whispering in the ear of his daughter, saying like, "Hey, get my enemy here, accuse him of witchcraft"? No, but these things go, right? I mean, what I say, little pictures and videos. Imagine the girls trying to go to sleep at night. In downstairs, Reverend Paris and his wife are talking, going, "That damn Francis Nurse, he's at it again," right? I think those sorts of things were a factor, and also too, it's like anything that makes people seem different. So, for example, Sarah Good, one of the first accused. Who is she? She's a poor woman, a local pauper, homeless, of addled mind and distemper, right? So she sort of fits that profile of sort of social outcast, marginalized folk. But on the other extreme, someone like Rebecca Nurse, there's nothing outcasty about her at all. She's a member of the church. Why Rebecca Nurse? Well, again, there's political problems, but also she and her husband had the audacity to take in an orphaned Puritan boy and raise him. Now, by our standards, that would be a wonderful act of Christian charity. But Quakers were seen as social outcasts as well. The Puritans hated them. And to actually, there must be, people say, there must be something wrong with that Rebecca and Francis. They took in a Quaker kid. They seem like such nice people, but why would they do that, right? So there are usually, long story short is, if you look at the individuals accused, there are usually some sorts of factors like that that make them stand out and lead to their accusation. Good question. Was one?
Maybe follow up along Quakers. Did Andros take over because the Puritans were executing the Quakers?
So, not directly, but yes. there were 4 Quakers executed in Massachusetts between 1659 and 1662, simply because they were Quakers and they came into the colony to proselytize. And Massachusetts passed a law saying, it's kind of okay if you're a Quaker in here, but if you come into the colony and try to proselytize, we're going to execute you, death penalty. So they actually executed 4 Quakers. And if you go to the State House in Massachusetts, you can see the statue to the right of the State House to Mary Dyer, who was one of the 4 victims, now it's a statute for religious freedom, right? So that had been a factor, but at the time, Massachusetts had just gotten a bad wrist slapping. But as things got worse in the 1680s, and finally the king was coming up with a long list of grievances against Massachusetts, and their mistreatment of Quakers was certainly a factor that had been taken into account, even though that had been in the distant past. And it also, by the way, explains, though, to me, why people like Rebecca Nurse and other friends and relatives of Quakers were accused in 1692, but no Quakers themselves. And again, these people were sort of tainted, guilt by association, but God forbid, people knew if any Quaker was executed for witchcraft, that was it. The king was going to pull the 1691 charter, and you were going to have someone like Andros come back, and it was going to be even worse. Yeah, exactly. So a lot of scholars have sort of pointed to those relationships with Quakers. And matter of fact, Sarah Good's last words, a very famous line, when Reverend Noyes, the junior minister in Salem, she's on the scaffold. She says, now, come clean, Sarah. We know you're a witch, and it would be good for your soul, what little you have of one, you know, to admit that you're a witch now. And she says, I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you execute me, God will give you blood to drink. About 20 years later, he died apparently of like a brain hemorrhage, where he did quite literally drink his own blood. But the interesting thing is about that line, it's actually a line from the Bible, and I thought originally she was just quoting from the Bible. But it actually is more than that. In 1661, I think it was, an Englishman wrote a book to the Massachusetts magistrates complaining to them about killing the Quakers. And he says, God will give you blood to drink for this. So in fact, Sarah Good, though she probably wasn't a Quaker, knew how to get Reverend Noyes. She was going to quote to him from the Bible, but also from a Quaker tract that she knew that would really upset him. So there's some really interesting ties there. Yeah, you might almost write a whole book on Quakers and witch trials. Any other questions? Well, thank you all very much.